From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am delighted to welcome you to our special program today. I'm Martha Kennedy. I'm a curator in the Prints and Photographs Division, and today we are going to hear a special lecture by one of this year's Swan Fellows, Julia Langbein. This event is sponsored by the Swan Foundation for Caricature and Cartoon and the Prints and Photographs Division. It is also being filmed for future webcast, so I ask you please to remember that if you take part in the Q&A afterward, you are granting permission to be included. A few words about the Swan Foundation. It is one of the few that provides direct support for scholarly graduate research in the field of caricature and cartoon through annually awarded fellowships. It has been a very important part of the library's graphic arts program since 1977. It underwrites an array of programs relating to caricature and cartoon, and these include preservation and processing of the library's comic arts collections, development of these collections, and related public programming, including ongoing exhibitions, including two that are now on view in the graphic arts galleries in the Jefferson Building. And in fact, I'd like to encourage you to see these newly opened exhibitions there. One of them is Her Block Looks at 1963, and the other is The Gibson Girls America, drawings by Charles Dana Gibson. Today's speaker, Julia Langbein, is a PhD candidate in art history at the University of Chicago, where she has been focusing on graphic satire and its relation to practices of art reception and criticism. Her doctoral dissertation examines a little studied genre of caricature that was widely published in the Parisian press during the last half of the 19th century. The practitioners of this art form, called Salon Caricature, comically distorted the paintings that were displayed at the annual or biennial state-sponsored Exhibition of the Arts in Paris, and they were published in illustrated journals. Julia has received many fellowships and awards, including a Frank Institute for the Humanities Dissertation Year Grant for 2012-13, the Francois Furet Travel Grant for summer of 2010, two American Friends of Chagall Society fellowships from the University of Chicago Department of Art History, a Fulbright fellowship for 2009 and 10, a research residency fellowship from the University of Chicago, and a Century Fellowship from the University of Chicago Humanities Division. She has published and presented papers on French caricaturists Cham and Daumier in scholarly venues, published art reviews, and taught 19th century French art as a lecturer at the University of Chicago. She brings a discerning eye and mind to her topic, and it has been a pleasure for me to assist her during her research residency here at the library. Please join me in welcoming Julia.
Hi. I'm going to move this furniture. It's okay. Hi. Thank you all for being here on this incredibly beautiful day. I thank each and every one of you personally for sacrificing an hour of sunshine. I'll try to make it worth it. I want to thank Martha Kennedy and everyone at Prints and Photographs for giving me such a warm welcome when I was here doing research back in February. So this is a kind of associative talk. It doesn't have one of those hard-driving arguments, but I think that hopefully the images that you'll get to see will make it worth it if it sometimes gets confusing. Also, I think an associative kind of talk is appropriate for Nadar, who's a figure that associated a lot of different worlds. So I should say up front that Nadar never piloted a hot air balloon into an art exhibition, although I'm not the first to imagine it. This caricature from La Lune in 1866 captures an essential crossing of the trajectories of the experience of the massive public exhibition in the Second Empire. Second Empire is roughly 1850 to 1870. The imaginary power of the balloonist's perspective and the comic representational capacities of the popular press. It's not surprising to find Nadar at this intersection. Born Felix Tournachon in 1820, he spent his youth side by side with the early Romantics, penned lithographs alongside Daumier during the golden age of political caricature, starved in the gutter alongside Henri Murger, who wrote the La Vie Bohème, rubbed shoulders with critics like Baudelaire and Gautier, set up one of the first and most famous photography studios where he photographed everyone from, this is a beautiful, beautiful photograph of Sarah Bernhardt, to the composer Hector Berlioz, and hosted the first Impressionist exhibition in his private home on the Boulevard des Capucines. My favorite fact about Nadar, one that's small but I think quite telling, is that he tutoyed everyone. That's to say he used the informal you form, risking the appearance of rudeness, but usually more accelerating the bonds of intimacy where decorum would have usually slowed them down. Author, caricaturist, photographer, aeronaut, and in a particularly modern way, someone I think we'd think of as a networker. Nadar hadn't begun ballooning when the Salon was still at the Louvre, where it had taken place from the mid-18th century until 1849, and whose Salon Carré, or Central Square Room, had given the great annual state-sponsored display of fine art in the French capital its name. Nor, for that matter, did Nadar pilot a balloon in the Palace of Industry, the giant iron and glass exhibition hall, constructed in this is an amazing video. This was made by Musée de Saint-Cloud, I think. I just discovered it recently, and I kind of dig the music too, but whatever. I'm going to let this kind of run in the background. This is an imagination of a digital recreation of what the Palais de l'Industrie, or the Palace of Industry, looked like. Yes, nor for that matter did Nadar pilot a balloon in the Palace of Industry, the giant iron and glass exhibition hall on the Champs-Élysées, constructed for the 1855 Paris World's Fair as an answer to London's 1851 Crystal Palace. The Palace of Industry housed the Salon from 1857 until it was given up by the French state in 1881. It would have been exceedingly difficult to fly a hot air balloon in the Louvre, anyway, whose cramped rooms and labyrinthine channels, given over as residences for artists in the 18th century and converted to a public museum after the French Revolution, never could have swallowed such a contraption. It would have been less preposterous to do so in the Palace of Industry, built to display items on an industrial scale, like locomotives and printing presses, with its wide berth, open plan, and stratospheric height. Balloon would have felt right at home. The hot air balloon had once been a plaything for amateurs and their aristocratic sponsors. The survivor of one of the first balloon flights in 1783 was a lamb named Montociel, or Climbs to the Skies, who lived out his post-aeronautic years in Marie Antoinette's fake peasant farm at Versailles. But by the middle of the 19th century, the balloon had become a labile symbol of particularly modern follies. We're going to leave this video behind. You get a sense of the scale. Yeah. Merci, Musée de Saint-Cloud. This is the flight was survived by the lamb. By the 19th century, the balloon had become a labile symbol of particularly modern follies. In a lithograph from La Caricature from 1839 entitled La Pommade du Lion, the balloon is proposed as a vehicle to sell snake oil to the inhabitants of the moon. It often stood for financial speculation. In another lithograph from a mid-century illustrated journal, a man who looks very much like the Emperor Louis Napoleon, attempting to reach the skies, excretes gold the way balloonists toss their ballast. In another, also from La Caricature, it participates in the hysteria of photographic positivism. It is this last notion that I want to fix on. If not the hysteria over the daguerreotype specifically, then at least the consistent association of the hot air balloon with vision and with optical devices such as the camera. Because what is, after all, a hot air balloon but an optical device, defined as an instrument constructed to assist vision? The only application of the balloon, which was not dirigible, meaning it couldn't be steered, so it couldn't reliably transport anyone from point A to point B, was to give a vantage point. in the only application of the balloon ever proposed by the French state before 1870, when it came in quite handy when Paris was under siege, one of Napoleon's marshals considered using tethered balloons to survey enemy troops. Because Nadar was also a photographer, his balloon was often represented as an airborne camera, basket as floating eye. And Nadar deployed the balloon as such, taking the first aerial shots of Paris from his 6,000 cubic meter balloon Le Géant in 1858. Because so few people actually traveled in hot air balloons, Nadar accepted 1,100 francs from the Prince of Wittgenstein for the pleasure of accompanying him in 1863. The balloon remained trapped in the rarefied currents of the symbolic or the imaginary for the great majority of people. It was this subjective vision, itself a spectacle, as in this photograph of Nadar's Géant at an 1863 demonstration. It was a symbol of a modern perspectival vantage, if not, for most, an experience of one. I thought it was interesting that they made a stereoscopic image of it. So interesting was it that you would want to see this in three dimensions. I want to return to the character from La Lune of Nadar at the Salon and dwell on this particular symbolic incarnation. Without delving too deeply into the discourse of Paris's urban transformations in the 19th century and the dense theoretical accounting for the extent to which older forms of social relations were reconstructed by modern capital, what I'm bracketing here is essentially everyone from Walter Benjamin to Guy Debord. You're welcome. I'm going to leave them out. We can nevertheless think about the relationship between modern visual culture and the experience of the salon or exhibition viewing through these images, paintings and caricatures that linked the two. If the balloon symbolized a new vantage point in the Second Empire, Paris was becoming in these years a city of new vantage points. Emperor Louis Napoleon's economically liberal empire encouraged speculation and credit, the emblem for which was Baron Haussmann, prefect of the Seine, credited, even over-credited, with remapping Paris according to the principle of spectacle. The new boulevards were straight and uniform and permitted sight lines from one end of Paris to the other, and would themselves become a theater in which the public could see and be seen. Small merchants were displaced, large mirrored department stores were born, old cramped medieval quarters were bulldozed, etc. In his Notre Dame de Paris, written in 1830, 20 years before the urban rebuilding that I just described, known as Haussmannization, Victor Hugo had already imagined such a process in the future, in which uniform facades would be imposed across the once varied city. He wrote, "I do not despair that Paris, seen from a balloon, should one day present that richness of line, that opulence of detail, that diversity of aspect, which characterizes a checkerboard." In other words, the character and individuality of Paris's urban forms might be plowed over, and the last vantage point from which it would retain its picturesque appeal would be, and this is utterly sarcastic on his point, the abstracting point of view of the balloonist. As T.J. Clark describes, T.J. Clark is a fantastic art historian. In his masterful essay, The View from Notre Dame, about the visual representations of Paris in the 1860s and 70s, the academic bromide that Paris in the Second Empire, the Paris of Baron Haussmann, was finally and completely given over to the logic of spectacle and the logic of capital, and therefore to spectacle of its own consumption, is critiqued as too neat, too finite. He makes the point that the old Paris may well have been in the process of demolition, but the new one had not yet taken form. To capture this argument concisely in images, we can compare Manet's 1867 painting of the World's Fair to Caillebot's Paris Street Rainy Day from 10 years later. Now, in 1877, the Caillebot, it's the big one, the Manet we'll get to in a minute. In 1877, the Haussmannized boulevards are complete and can seduce Caillebot, the former shipbuilder with a love of angles, to give them polished and precise form and paint. Now the urban strolling, the consumption of the boulevard, the alienation of individuals alone in the crowd, at once uniform and separated by the identical mass-produced umbrellas. Here I'm rehearsing a pretty careworn analysis, but nevertheless the comparison to the Manet in passing will be useful. In Manet's Universal Exposition of 1867, the city is putting its, right away there's a completely different surface texture. The city is putting itself on display for the world, but it doesn't quite hold together as a dazzling spectacle. It's got a deadpan comedy to it, and its failure to do so. if Haussmann's boulevards have cleared the way for sight lines and stages, clarity of vision hardly dominates from the Butte Chaillot, this sort of cliff looking down on the city. Instead of the uniform of the black bourgeois frock coat, a parade of various types, some like the gold-buttoned soldiers that we could even say persist from an older Paris, tradition and modernity coexisting. Everyone is engaged at some level with the visual consumption of the fair. To quote T.J. Clark, quote, enjoying the exhibition and making sure their enjoyment is noticed, gaping, strolling, pointing things out to one another. The exhibition structures of the World's Fair, including the Palace of Industry somewhere in this wet, flimsy, gray and tan cross-hatching, occupy the middle ground. And again, to quote Clark, the actors move about in front of it as if it were all painted. This is a painting of people consuming Paris as if the city itself were an art exhibition. But it's also a fantasy of the exhibition viewed from the hot air balloon. The stiff, fractured parade of various types of people, the discrepancies of scale and the illegibilities of the landscape, might cohere, might in fact become picturesque for whomever is manning the balloon at the top right, which is in fact none other than Nadar's balloon, Le Géant, which was flown at the 1867 World's Fair. As so often, the imaginary perspective of the hot air balloon, one for which the chaos of the modern city or the spectacle or the exhibition will coalesce, calls for another optical device, the binoculars. There's a guy whose back is facing us and is next to the woman with the big bow is looking through binoculars. The balloon with its distance needs, if it's to be reciprocated, binoculars or a telescope. The unifying distance of the hot air balloon and the isolating, selective magnification of the binoculars. Both are needed to aid natural vision when faced with the canvas of New Paris. The point of the comparison with the Caillebotte is that the Caillebotte points toward a Paris in which the city's status as a spectacle has reached a kind of saturation or smoothness. The man and the woman at right are engaged in continuous visual consumption of the city. In the Manet, viewing the city is made over into viewing an artifice, a canvas. In the Caillebotte, to view the canvas is to enter the city, to step onto the sidewalk, to be pulled into the whooshing perspective of the street. Manet's, on the other hand, is decentralized, off-balance, full of mysterious whirlwinds of difficult-to-read paint, undermining the spectacle of the exhibition and asking what kind of vision it will require. Caillebotte's is the answer to that question. Is the answer that the city 10 years later will give. In a sense, Caillebotte's Paris is made for the urban stroller, not for the balloonist. It's not chaotic or fractured. 30 years after describing the vantage point of the balloon in Notre Dame de Paris, Victor Hugo returned to it in a letter of support for Nadar's 1864 balloon flight. He wrote, "It is the abolition of all boundaries. It is the destruction of separation. It's the prodigious peaceful revolution, a magnificent transformation, to own the ether, to possess the planet." In 1830, the modern remapping of Paris had only been a fiction. In 1864, it was well underway, and Hugo's sarcasm is gone, replaced by a kind of melancholy. Now the balloon is an escape fantasy, a lofty, utopic bid that Nadar might momentarily erase the destruction of Paris and, quote, possess the planet. If the balloon symbolizes a new vantage point that is the companion to modern Paris's chaotic transformations, what's it doing in the Salon? Why are new vantage points suddenly called for at art exhibitions? Why won't natural vision do? At the salons that had taken place in the Louvre, the paintings were displayed in the traditional touche-à-touche manner, frames touching each other, completely unlike the modernist single-row hang to which we've become accustomed or have even internalized as natural. This is a painting of the Salon of 1824, done in 1827. But the numbers of works displayed had not presented too daunting a challenge to the cognitive abilities of the art viewer. At the turn of the 19th century, there were regularly around 500 works, and by the 1820s, between the 1820s and 1849, the number of works displayed hovered at around 2,000. Today, blockbusters might show a few hundred works maximum, and they're heavily curated. These not curated really at all. Artists and administrators skirmished about the ideal composition and role of the jury until the institution's demise. But despite artists' protests that the jury was too severe, between 1857 and 1870, the number of works swelled from 3,500 to over 5,400, and by 1880 there were over 7,000. The Palace of Industry could contain such a quantity, but qualitatively, what kind of experience did this constitute for spectators, as works were, one journal complained, shoved in the basement, stuffed in the rafters? In the Palace of Industry, Nadar could have overcome the complaints so often repeated by salon goers and by artists that the works positioned high up in the rafters were invisible. A complaint often made in Caricatures is a terrible reproduction. But the caricaturist, by a caricaturist named Sham, but his point is that you can't see it because of the glare. They were too far away to be seen clearly, and the bright daylight that flooded the enormous space from the iron and glass ceiling created obscuring glare on many of the highly varnished canvases. Nadar could have studied the paintings in the lower registers and then, satisfied with them, fed his brazier and mounted up to the paintings at the top, which had been so disadvantageously positioned. This is a relatively straightforward frustration of vision, or rationality and comprehension as a function of vision at the art exhibition. The idea that the scale of the salon was simply beyond the capacities of an individual to intake. Still, it prompted comparisons to the panorama, the 360-degree painting through which a spectator entered from below and whose continuous scope created an immersive illusion through his inability to intake the whole thing from any one point. There's one that exists still in The Hague, the Mesdag panorama. I highly suggest that you go. Sites of urban spectacle popped comparatively into the minds of critics writing about the salon with more and more frequency. In fact, with almost cliched frequency in the Second Empire. It's a great department store. It's a gallery of wax figures. It's a panorama. It's Boulevard Theater. What prompted these comparisons? At the Louvre, a temporary crimson fabric had been laid over the permanent collection. Go back to this. Laid over the permanent collection, and the salon paintings hung on top. The critic Gustave Planche wrote in 1831, complimenting the placement of paintings, "Who would dare to complain about where his painting is hung when he sees that the portrait or the landscape that he sent in is attached precisely in the same place as a Rubens or a Murillo?" Tradition and stability literally underpinned the contemporary paintings that the salon displayed. At the Palace of Industry, on the contrary, rather than seeing contemporary painting layered atop masterpieces from the history of art, a salon goer would see a painting hung in a massive gallery where only weeks earlier he'd seen an equine show or fabric fair. In the 18th century, paintings had been commissioned, and the dominant genre had been the large-scale history painting. The arc of art production across the century sees the precipitous decline of this kind of state-sponsored grande peinture, or great painting, and the concomitant rise of lower, more commercially viable genres of portraiture, landscape, and genre scene. At the dawn of the salon, nothing had been for sale. By the 1860s, not only was almost everything for sale, but in the absence of anything like curatorial practice, paintings were hung in alphabetical order by painter's name, suggesting to some a rationalized sales catalog that prompted comparisons to the department store. Compared to the rootedness of the Louvre in history and tradition, critic Edmond About described the very flimsiness of the construction of the Palace of Industry. He wrote in 1864, he described the infrastructure as so illusory seeming, so fleeting and airy, that even the flower beds which lined the rows of the sculpture garden seemed like a thin veneer of spectacular contrivance. Quote, "It's impossible to believe that these flowers have roots," which may remind one of the flower beds lining the Butte Chaillot in Manet's 1867 canvas, which wear their artifice, their paintedness, so obviously. It seems they're even tended to by a gardener wielding not so much a water hose as a paintbrush. Large format paintings of biblical and mythological scenes were more or less conceptually harmonious when viewed as an ensemble. In this distribution of the medals at the Salon of 1824, Heim, the painter, can still represent the grand cour d'honneur, the big central room, as an orderly event presided over by noble figures in togas, a Christian saint, a general. Values are clear in the works themselves, nobility, the church, the state, and in the awards delivered. But as the lower genres took over, the potential for disharmony spread, particularly as subjects taken not from history or mythology, but from contemporary life proliferated. there was an increased potential for accidentally comic or disruptive juxtaposition. A photograph from the Salon of 1861 shows a painting by a now forgotten student of Léon Cogniet, who's actually now also been pretty forgotten, named Jean-François. It's like, I see a lot of that. Jean-François Gauze, entitled Leaving Church, 16th century. I'm talking about the person in the, what we would call a Shakespeare collar. This is a typical genre scene, part of the vogue for Dutch or Dutch-like subjects in the second half of the 19th century. But the stiff costuming, the pose itself taken from old master style portraits, comes into comic juxtaposition with the ones alongside it, particularly two paintings over the relaxed, sentimental father-daughter portrait next to it. Stranger, the underlining both of these is a lascivious satyr prodding a sprawling nude Venus. An image like Leaving Church might have been in previous decades sheltered by the consistency of historical subjects. But surrounded by contemporary subjects, by walls and walls particularly full of contemporary portraiture, the Marquise de blah blah blah, a sheep herder from Normandy, it became difficult not to see such a painting as a contemporary figure in some kind of ridiculous getup. In Nadar's caricature of the painting from Le Journal Amusant in 1861, he remakes the painting as a playing card. It's at the bottom left. The Queen of Spades. A token of café culture. Cheaply printed, industrially-produced paper trinket, most likely to be seen in the left hand of someone whose right hand is holding a drink. One critic wrote that the never-ending walls of the salon at the Palace of Industry were so glutted with contemporary portraits that one almost felt like one was navigating an urban crowd on the very walls, albeit one where, occasionally alongside a young father and daughter, a naked woman might appear. The nude became particularly troublesome once the mythological haze evaporated, and timeless Venuses became contemporary women who'd suddenly look down at themselves and realize they'd left the house stark naked. This is another one. I didn't track down who painted this one, but here's Nadar's caricature of it. And he recreates the composition, more or less. He doesn't try to transpose it into a contemporary woman, but his kind of ancient, noble suffering of this Hercules is turned into this woman just removed his tooth. So again, it's hard for nobility, grand sentiments, the philosophy of grande peinture to survive in this environment. The unfortunate juxtaposition of paintings with different historical or philosophical traditions was increasingly joined by another problem: the flourishing of stylistic individuality that had its roots in Romanticism but became more extreme in the 1860s. Monet, Degas, Bazille, Manet, people you've actually heard of, all displayed their work at the Salon when the juries did not reject them in the 1860s and 70s. The comic potential here is perfectly summed up in a caricature by Bertal from 1870. Bazille's Bathers, Bazille is sort of part of the Proto-Impressionist group, died in 1870 at the Siege of Paris, but would have been another Monet. With their chalky Proto-Impressionist facture and their bright, unmixed colors, were displayed next to a traditional sentimental made by Chapelain. The placement of the two paintings was an accident. It was just purely due to the fact that Chapelain follows Bazille in the alphabet. There's no curatorial practice, I will remind you. In Bertal's caricature, the bathers ask the maid for some of her wine so that they can get some color. My point is not that this is a brilliant joke, but that the very application of color, content aside, could create a comic spectacle between paintings. This contagion or contamination between paintings, what I've come to think of as the invasion of a particularly comic spectacle, is a problem on the side of perception, because it's partly due, what I'm saying is that it has to do with vision, because it's partly due to the fatigue and disorientation that the overwhelming spectacle of the Salon heaps on the spectator. Nadar prefaced his 1857 album of Salon Caricature by asking, "Has it not happened to you to find yourself seeing double, the heart weakened, the stomach churning at the Salon? When this happens to you, Wouldn't you slit the throat of 10 mistresses? Here he's no doubt referring to all the portraits of elegant ladies at the salon. He's not a horrible misogynist. To rest your eyes on a stockbroker? On a stockbroker and on a horse too. On a carriage, on a candy store, or on a seller of newspapers, on anything from that which makes life real and brutal. Is this all no more than a little question of physical fatigue? An animal irritation? What good are painters? Nadar loves painting. He came of age among these romantic painters, was close with people like Célestin Nanteuil, maybe you've heard of, and Gustave Doré, who people from Prince will know about. Admired Delacroix, defended the values of what he would have called his bohemian upbringing. He was no iconoclast, and when he's asking what good are painters, in the preface to his Salon Caricature, he's really asking how can the work of a painter articulate anything meaningful when the experience of it is so disorienting that you will run for comfort into the arms of such comparatively brutal modern figures as a stockbroker or a newspaper seller. How does a salongoer combat the kaleidoscope of incommensurate styles and signifiers? Nadar wrote of viewing the world from the hot air balloon, everything is far away. Cares, remorse, disgust, how easily contempt drops away from on high and forgiveness descends. For Nadar, who became so obsessed with ballooning that it drove him completely bankrupt, ruined his photography practice, the vantage point of the balloon was nothing less than grace. There was no possibility for grace at the salon, no way to get so high above the salon that forgiveness might descend. But his answer to the question of how to extract some kind of meaning, despite the fatigue, the fracture, the chaos, the sickness of so much unassimilable art, was the comic vantage point of caricature. It's not just to stretch the comparison to the balloon that I call caricature a vantage point. Rather than describe just one painting at a time the way the narrative medium of criticism must, Nadar's caricature is an all-consuming perspective, which shows, if not the whole spectacle, then at least a wall at a time, capturing the contagion between paintings, unifying the incommensurate with his own individual style, combating the comic juxtapositions by making them the overriding principle of his entire effort. Salon Caricature miniaturizes the exhibition, as if seen from far away, and allows the reader to entertain a fantasy of possession, the whole ensemble of a demarcated portion of the salon contained in his or her hands. This is the part where I explain why this is important. For art historians, it's a niche genre, but for art historians, the salon serves as the backbone for studies in 19th century French art and much of 19th century European art more generally. I'm going to just cite Thomas Crowe's, an art historian's powerful description of the salon, really exactly why it's important. It is the first regularly repeated, open and free display of contemporary art in Europe to be offered in a completely secular setting and for the purpose of encouraging a primarily aesthetic response in large numbers of people. I know that was a boring sentence, but there's a lot of meaning in it. As such, it was the first European forum for public art criticism, which emerged in the 18th century, became professionalized in the 19th. It is the essential context for monographic work on artists such as Gros, Géricault, Ingres, Delacroix, Barbizons, Realism, Romanticism, Courbet, Manet. I could go on. It is the institution against which private circles like the Impressionists reacted. From 1791 on, the Salon accepted foreign artists, so it's important in considering people like the British landscape artist John Constable or the American James Whistler. So in my work, I've been exploring this institution from a different point of view, that of its representation in the popular press. And it's become clear to me that while art historians thoroughly account for one painter or one painting at a time through considerations of its reception, that is to say, through considerations of the written critical response to works of art, we've inadequately considered the spectacular changes undergone by the event in the second half of the 19th century. All of these things that I've been describing to you. There are two reasons for this. The first is that other 19th century visual spectacles like the panorama or the wax museum flourished under later conditions of mass culture in the 1880s and 90s and cemented continuous legacies of spectacle. The panorama, for example, has been written into the history of cinema. The department store has perhaps the most progeny in the discourse of mass culture spectacle consumption. The Salon, by contrast, was relinquished by the state in 1880 to the hands of artists. It fractured into smaller public and private galleries run by increasingly powerful dealers. The rise of the dealer-critic system. It's a good catchphrase there. It essentially gave way to private exhibitions, such as those of the Impressionists, who began to show together in 1874 at the home of Nadar. These private, commercial, independent galleries emphasize cultivation, concentration, in intimate, private, gaslit, domestic spaces. They literally put potted plants in their little galleries so you would feel like you were in someone's private home. So threatening had the sort of public bazaar of the Salon become. Although I would remark in passing that while the spectacle of the Paris Salon fizzled out before the fin de siècle, perhaps today the legacy of the public exhibition as spectacle is reemerging in the biennial and art fair culture that's come to dominate the global carousel of the contemporary art market. And I think some of these issues that I'm talking about resurge in, I don't know about your, but my experience of biennials. This part about the stomach churning particularly. The second reason art historians haven't taken up the notion of the spectacular conditions of the Salon is that they so often turn to written art criticism to account for the visual without taking into account the biases of the written critic. It would have been against their interests for writers producing Salon Reviews in the Second Empire, and there were scores and scores of them. Salon Reviews appeared in train timetables. To admit that the Salon was an unnerving phantasmagoria which eroded meaning and produced a comic spectacle, when their job was to serve as a rational and comprehending guide. The very justification of a Salon critic's existence was that he possessed steely aesthetic judgment. Therefore, the vast majority of critics who remark on the disorienting subjectivity of the salon goer suggest that other people are prey to this. A writer for La Revue Contemporaine, sort of arts and culture review, named Alphonse de Calonne, who you've never heard of because he's a terrible critic. He's really bad. Is anything new, you just turn away from it. Described the Salon as a sign painter's bazaar in which the crowd, unlike a distinguished amateur or artist, habituates its eyes to the spectacle of the false and ugly. Little by little, he says, the amateur can find a path, a coherent narrative. Unlike the floating attention of the crowd, attention that drifts undirigible like a hot air balloon, Calonne controls his path by refusing to look at a great deal of art, blinding himself to works that challenge his perception. I've not been stopped in passing, he wrote, by any strange, frightened, or frightening compositions, which pull the eye right away and clash with all principles and conventions. While Nadar wants to encounter the frightening and is trying to figure out how to. In the Salon of 1861, one imagines that he would have walked up to leaving the church, right, the Shakespearean collar, with his hands on each side of his temples, keeping the encroachment of the variety and glut on his scopic abilities at bay, while for everyone else, the spectacle coruscates and seduces. But caricature, this is from the journal La Vie Parisienne, I think a great representation of the Salon is chaotic. Caricature had no obligation to find a path. Instead, it feasted upon the overwhelming comic spectacle of the Salon. The genre of Salon caricature exploded in the press in exactly the years of this spectacular crisis, peaking in the 60s and 70s. The balloon in this discussion has floated away a little, but it serves as a prompt for thinking about specifically modern modes of perception that were linked with changes in the urban landscape that surrounded the exhibition. Nadar's frontispiece for his 1857 album of Salon Caricature was not a balloon, but a different optical device, a magic lantern. The metaphor was an apt one. Magic lantern shows were something like 19th century slideshows, again, part of the prehistory of cinema, where transparencies made of painted glass were slipped over the aperture of a black box containing a light and a mirror that concentrated the light in a dark room, casting an image on the wall for spectators immersed in darkness. Nadar's frontispiece, itself posing as a magic lantern slide with its silhouetted shapes blacked out, shows Nadar holding the slide in his hand, reminding the reader that the illusion had two parts, a miniature handheld version of the image and the intangible spectacle that it projected on the wall, the large-scale intangible spectacle. While referencing the spectacular entertainments of the boulevards, Nadar's metaphor of the magic lantern for salon caricature casts salon paintings as ghost-like, immaterial, even frightening. The content of magic lantern shows was often frightening, devils, the dead, characters from Gothic novels, but emanating from a handheld miniature. Although I've made an attempt at a rapprochement of Nadar the caricaturist and Nadar the balloonist, we've hit the firm border between them at this point. The balloonist and the salon spectator are always on the side of reception of spectacle, no matter their degrees of mastery, competence, or possession in the face of spectacle. They have, in a sense, their hands tied behind their back, or in the case of the balloonist, their hands occupied with binoculars. But Nadar, they're floating eyes, like the image of the camera on the balloon. But Nadar reminds us that the salon caricaturist is not merely a spectator. He's the man behind the curtain, too, a producer of images. His salon caricature distinguishes itself from that of others. Sham, for example, the caricaturist I mentioned in passing, who did the caricature of the painting that you couldn't see, through its relentless insistence on the hand. The transformation of the Dutch historical portrait into the playing card, for example, something miniature and handheld. His caricature of Courbet's women on the banks of the Seine from 1857 is another example, in which the women have been made into dolls on round pedestals with hinged joints. If that seems like a banal enough insult, an accusation of mere childlike talent, or something along those lines on the part of Nadar about Courbet, I would argue that the very factor of the caricature itself underscores its being a handmade thing. Heavy striations in the background, variation in the size and direction of the thick strokes, almost like a German woodcut. He signs the caricature by Nadar and Courbet, reminding us that this is a layered performance of painting and caricature, of first Courbet's hand, which Nadar appreciatively calls vigorous in the text, and his own miniature, textured, handheld version of it. The balloon might have suggested itself as a metaphor for the salon spectator, but the magic lantern was Nadar's choice for the metaphor of the salon caricaturist, while the balloon offered an imaginary transcendence of the chaos of the salon. The magic lantern metaphor reversed the relationship between original and reproduction, comforting the reader that the salon was merely a frightening specter and the real thing was in his hands. Thank you. Hot under the spotlight. So are there questions? Or
yes.
Should I cede this to you?
No.
No.
You go right ahead. Please ask questions. We have a few minutes for that.
Have you found any, I guess, correlating discussion that might happen in either Britain or America that kind of might parallel this discussion of French caricature and
The British comparison is interesting because there's such a strong tradition of caricature,
right.
but there isn't a salon caricature, and I think it has to do with the fact that there isn't this. First of all, Britain was always a much more private market. There was never the same kind of state sponsorship, so there was never the descriptions that I gave you of the 18th century salon with these kind of big, large-scale history paintings. That never had a history in England. So there isn't the same kind of loss of dignity that the caricatures can play up. Where there is salon caricature is in Russia, because the Russians create an imperial academy based on the French system. So the way that these jokes can only work. You can't Google the original, painting in 1857. So there's one academy and there's one massive public exhibition. So everyone has a shared common knowledge in order for these jokes to work. And so I think that's the kind of precondition for this genre. And that's why the exact thing happens in Russia. There's like a flourishing, and a former Swan fellow actually worked on it and described it as a kind of veiled political caricature. Yeah. Yeah.
The Salon and then the Great World Exhibition.
Yeah. So many things in there. On which aspect?
Well, on the aspect of
how the sort of urban.
Well, examples perhaps of caricature of the Grand World Exhibitions or later exhibitions.
Well, let's see. So caricature doesn't really take for a subject things like the panorama or the Boulevard Theater. It does take the people for subject. There's a lot of social caricature, but that's a sort of longer standing thing. I think. I mean, that's part of a long French tradition of physiognomical caricature. The relationship to the city is really, or to this sort of notion of burgeoning mass culture, actually it's more that sort of this, the Illustrated Journal and the booming popular press is often seen as a boulevard of its own. That there's a kind of analogy there, that this is also one of these many things that I'm describing, part of the culture of spectacle, or the sort of fabrication of everyday life into something to be consumed. That's what this is the fait divers, the sort of current events in the newspaper and so on. So the ability of caricature even to keep pace with modern life, to re-represent it as it's happening, is very much talked about in any event, and sort of in the discourse of of these kinds of diversions, part of the culture of spectacle. So that's one connection.
Your phrase about the characterization of everyday life, that's exactly what I was thinking of.
Yeah.
In some of these grand exhibitions, they create it by creating the souk or the different ethnic or geographic, they created caricatures of the Egyptians.
Oh, right.
And I wondered whether those caricatures that were created in 3 dimensions in real time, whether those were then also caricatured.
Well, you're sort of suggesting a kind of companion project to mine, because I'm suggesting that the salon has become a comic spectacle, and that caricature is newly adequate to represent that. And I can imagine a project where somebody might look at the World's Fair, which is a really hot topic in the study of visual culture, these world fairs, and think about, we think of this in the history of ethnography and colonialism and all these things. But I wonder if they weren't also comic spectacles, if there weren't also incredible juxtapositions, but when you have a souk lined up next to Belgian waffle makers or whatever. There's ridiculous things like that.
Which you didn't exactly, because in those exhibitions, as in the real world, there were gated communities. So
Oh yeah, you wouldn't have such contamination.
whites were here and
Well, then in that case, you could cite me and say Julia Langbein's notion of comic spectacle is not what we find here. Go for it. Any other questions? Yeah.
You mentioned that this hasn't really been looked at by a lot of art historians,
Mhm.
and I was wondering, when looking at how art reflects mass culture and
Yeah.
kind of a modernist consumer capitalism, I guess how common is it in kind of the discipline of art history to use the application of the spectacle for analysis? 'Cause, I'm really familiar with it more in terms of social sciences.
Yeah, it's really that's actually my nightmare question. No, because the sort of theory and the discourse of the spectacle is so dense, and it is a really important way of thinking about. Yeah, I mean, Guy Debord. I just saw the Guy Debord exhibit at the BNF in Paris, and it blew my mind. There are so many different definitions of it, and I'm not working in the presentation that I just gave you with any one particularly well-defined one. I'm sort of using it as it's defined on the go, like in that Alphonse de Calonne, that horrible critic who talks about how others are susceptible to spectacle. That's sort of, I'm trying to work with it on the ground in this present for these purposes. But yeah, it is an incredibly important way of thinking through. This sort of Marxist ideas of social forms and relations. Yeah.
I'm just curious, was there a response to these in the journals? Any sort of discussion, sort of follow-up discussion to the caricatures, caricaturists' works? You know, their versions.
Do you mean, did the journal publish responses from artists or anything like that?
Yeah.
No, I haven't really found any kind of response. I mean, Jerome, a painter, 19th century kind of academic painter, was caricatured by Sham endlessly. And Jerome ended up writing the preface to a collection of Sham's caricatures much later. So I think in a way, not to sort of use a cliche like this, but sort of any publicity is good publicity or something like that. Is that what you were just saying? Yeah. Already. Yeah, there is. I mean, I'm sure that there were painters that were deeply injured, as painters often are. But what I'm coming to realize more and more with Manet is actually that he's so aware of salon caricature, and he's so aware of all of these possibilities for comedy, and really is internalizing, I think, in the way he paints. He's taking account of the same kinds of things that caricaturists are taking account of. And so there's this real proximity between the ways that they think about images and the spectacle of the image, really. For example, the person, the Shakespeare collar person, right, and the way that on that salon wall, it looks so, when there's this nice regular guy and his daughter a painting or two away, that this looks so, and this isn't even the best example, actually. This happens to be one where I found the caricature by Nadar and so on. But that is, for those of you who are fans of Manet, and if, you can go right down the street to the National Gallery and just have a blast with Manet. There's some really amazing Manet there. But this awareness in his, he paints these figures, he's exactly in this kind of aspect ratio, these full portrait figures, and they look like contemporary people dressed in ridiculous costume, right? They're in these flat backgrounds and so on. So this deadpan comedy that people haven't really been able to account for in Manet, I think comes from his awareness of these same conditions. So, I hope I publish that before this goes up. Nobody repeat that. All right. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for sitting and listening on this beautiful day, really.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.